As the 2020 presidential election in the United States recently occurred, and the counting has been going on even after so many days have passed due to some historic changes in how the election occurred, several irregularities have been noticed. In this scenario, Benford's law as a tool is being looked at by some people on the internet and possibly some investigators to look whether a voter fraud has occurred. Whether a voter fraud has occurred or not in this election, Benford's law is usually one of the tools adopted by the fraud investigators, especially in the field of finance, to find irregularities that have explanation in some human element. As the arguments and counter-arguments usually go on the internet, some arguments that criticize the use of Benford's law in this election form the subject of the discussion in this video. A lot of counter-arguments on the subject miss what is being claimed. As an experimental analysis, this video looks at how sticking close to the claim being made is essential in understanding the points being raised. What is Benford's law, by the way? Benford's law is a mathematical law which looks at the distribution of digits in a number obtained from the real world and argues that the probability of occurrence of a digit d as the first digit of such number must be equal to log base 10 1 plus 1 by d. The rationale for application of Benford's law on real-world data is simple, because a slight relative change in numbers with low magnitudes, that is, numbers with smaller first digits, has lower absolute change than in number with higher first digits. Smaller number must occur as first digit of a number with more frequency than larger digits. For example, a 15% increase in 10 would not change the first digit of 10, but a 15% increase in 80 would surely make the 8 in 80 to be 9. This would be the case if the number is natural or real. In the case the number is not real and random, then the occurrence would be divergent to the Benford's distribution. Like all statistical tests, Benford's law does not prove fraud or some illegality. Illegality is a matter of law and not of statistics. But any deviation from Benford's law must have an explanation. One of these explanations can be presence of fraud. In this case, Benford's law is not different from other tests, like tests of regression, where any pattern in the data that is different from randomness is hypothesized to have an explanation. That explanation causes a divergence that can be known through regression, over and above the error term, which denotes randomness. Similarly, in case of Benford's law, the deviation from Benford's distribution must, by addition onto the Benford process, change the distribution. But such deviation, it is presumed, would have to have an explanation. Thus something must be remembered while using Benford's law. In order to separate the explainable deviation from the unexplained deviation, the graphs obtained should not be just compared to the ideal distribution, but to each other as well, across place and time. This allows the use of control to assess an unexplained deviation. This is where the counter-arguments fail. For example, in his video, Why Do Biden's Votes Not Follow Benford's Law? Stand-Up Maths gives a very good argument as to why Benford's law would not apply in Chicago, an area which historically has been won by Democrats. It is because if size of a precinct is artificially controlled, which it is normally, then for an election race, the first digit test of Benford's law would not work as the peak of the distribution would be already shifted. Let us listen to the guy on Stand-Up Maths.
Let's talk Biden. Why does their data not match Benford's law when Trump's seemingly does? Well, I looked into the data that was being used in this analysis, and it's from Chicago. And in the US, each state does its election itself. And right down to the city level is a little bit different everywhere, and how they divide up the population changes slightly. In Chicago, they have 2,069 precincts. Now these are clumped into wards and counties and so on. However, the data people were analyzing is from those individual just over 2,000 precincts. And if you go on to the Chicago Board of Election Commissioners website, you can actually download the total number of votes as well as the breakdown by candidate for every single precinct, all 2,069 of them. So I downloaded that data. That's how I double checked that these plots are correct. If you get the lead digits, you get exactly these. Double checked it myself. But then I looked at the sizes of the precincts, and they're picked to be roughly the same population each. So it shouldn't be that surprising when you realize they're all about the same size. The smallest one had a mere 39 votes cast in it. The biggest one had 1,655. The average, however, was about 500. It was 516, and the standard deviation is super tight. They're all clumped roughly around the middle. There are only 7 precincts which had fewer votes than 100, and there were only 20 precincts which had 1,000 or more votes, which means 98.7% of all precinct vote totals was a 3-digit number. This has got like the opposite of several orders of magnitude. Almost every precinct reported pretty much the same number of votes, and they were all smack bang in the middle of the range of 3-digit numbers. Of course, we're not going to get a Benford distribution out of this. While I had the data up, I also went through and categorized every single vote total that Biden got in 10 vote bins. I then plotted that distribution, and you can see it's basically a normal distribution and quite a tight one. That's because Biden was overwhelmingly the favorite in the Chicago area. So basically, the range of the total number of votes available in each precinct was clumped around the middle of 3-digit numbers, and Biden got a really consistent percentage of that, which is why they've got this normal distribution. And if you look at their Benford first-digit results, what you're actually looking at is just a simplified version of that distribution. So given this is the distribution of the votes, which perfectly matches what we would expect from everything else we know about the area, of course that's what we're going to get. And at the beginning of the video, I had a very short quote from Benford's Law and the Detection of Election Fraud. And if people actually read through that paper, it describes exactly this. Partway down, it says, if a competitive 2-candidate race occurs in districts whose magnitude varies between 100 and 1,000, the modal first digit for each candidate's vote will not be 1 or 2, but rather 4, 5, or 6. And this is exactly what we're looking at here. The paper describes this exact situation and says how normal it is. I'll link to the paper below if you want to check it out. And actually, one other quote from the main kind of summary of the paper, from the abstract. It says here, it is not simply that Benford's law occasionally judges a fraudulent election fair or a fair election fraudulent. Its success rate either way is essentially equivalent to a toss of a coin, thereby rendering it problematic at best as a forensic tool and wholly misleading at worst. In short, you can't just use Benford's law to look for fraud in elections.
You'd have noticed that in order to convince us, he gives us a reason why Benford's law is not applicable. The reason is what deviates the distribution from what would be normally observed. His argument is that because precinct size is very congested around mean by design, and the magnitude of order is low, the probability of occurrence of number 1 to 9 in first place would be dependent on the precinct sizes, given the general voting pattern is already fixed. However, there is a problem using that argument to dismiss Benford's law. Why does Trump's distribution look more like Benford's law, considering that if Biden's voting pattern is assumed to be fixed, so is Trump's? There are 3 critiques of the video that Stand-Up Maths addresses. Let us look at each of them. The first critique is why Stand-Up Maths guy did not use data from swing states, which are important in determining the winner in this election. Well, he says that he was sent the data of Chicago precincts, and that was being used to claim election fraud. In his description, he gives 2 sources. Let's check them out. The first source has data of many areas and not just Chicago. Maybe the one who sent the link to Stand-Up Maths guy sent a link of Chicago from the folder. However, the link just contains the analysis of the data of several areas where Benford's law is not applicable. Whether Chicago is an important piece of the puzzle is claimed by yet another source, which he links. But that source points out issues in several areas and not just in Chicago. In fact, even the paper linked by a stand-up maths guy, which says that the use of Benford's law to determine fraud either way is like a toss of a coin, mentions that in competitive areas, Benford's law would work far better. The caveat here is that it uses the second digit and not the first, but in that case, a better approach would be to take the second digit. Let's do that in case of Chicago. We find that second digit's distribution for Biden's voter tally is very strange. The issue with the video by stand-up maths guy is that while the video is very informative and considers appropriate counter-arguments as to why Benford's law's application is problematic, it does not look at all the good arguments as to why it might still be useful. Let's move to the second critique. The second critique is why in the test of first digit, Trump's voter tally from Chicago follows Benford's law. The stand-up maths guy argues that the Trump's tally does not follow the distribution entirely. There is a massive spike at 1 and not enough at 3, 4 and 5. That is again true. However, why does Trump's distribution follow Benford's law? Otherwise, it appears that Benford's law is followed in Trump's data, but that it just has massive deviations. That is because Benford's law forms the general baseline. Above that, the unique voting pattern of the state and artificial size of the precincts distorts Benford's distribution. That means that while the observable distribution cannot be compared to the ideal distribution, it can be compared to the previous observed distributions. Let us do that. In 2020 presidential election, Trump once had a massive increase of 9 percentage points of his total tally as compared to his 2016 results. That is the deviation that needs to be explained. That cannot be based on precinct sizes because we control for that by comparison with the year which had almost similar distribution of precincts. This anomaly forms the basis of further investigation. In fact, increase in Trump's ones seems to be coming from his threes and fours. This may be due to several reasons. It may be because the earlier threes and fours voters now do not like Trump as much, so they vote for him in ones, or it may be due to stealing of votes. To find that, an investigation would be required. The third critique is about the paper. It may form the basis of another video, but there, the stand-up maths guy points out how a second digit test may be valid in certain circumstances, while the first digit test may not be. If that is the case, it would be appropriate if the video had performed the second digit test as well, which shows some oddities too, but it does not. The issue with the video is that while it is informative in understanding the arguments of the side claiming that the Benford's test does not show voter fraud, it does not do well to represent the argument of the side that claims it does. At the end of the day, Benford's test cannot be the smoking gun to prove election fraud anyways, just like no test does, because while the test may be admissible in the court, it does not prove illegality, which requires proper investigation. But which areas to investigate may as well need Benford test to be determined, because one cannot just search all. Identification of oddities is important in that respect. But the biggest problem with the video is not the video, but its comment section. Take for example this comment. This sarcastic comment perfectly represents how people need to rely on experts. In fact, designated experts to think. Even with the tools and worksheets available, it is bizarre that people think that it is heretical how a layperson can disagree with experts. Which is funny because the whole idea of stand-up maths channel and channels like these is to allow laypeople a way to dive into complex mathematical questions. It is hilarious that one layperson would mock other supposed laypersons because they disagreed with the designated experts, even though the layperson mocking is perhaps too stupid himself to know what the expert is talking about. If the designated experts and these woke laypersons had their say, they would make a cult out of mathematics and science. Much better than these people are the people who are trying to perform statistical analysis and trying to understand the arguments as to why Benford's law can prove or cannot prove election fraud in the 2020 presidential election of the US.